This happened to me in the fall of 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. My friend, let's call him Jay, and I were on our way from NYC to Michigan to do a couple of vinyl flooring jobs and also scout some potential properties to renovate and flip. We were using his work truck, which was a Ford F-150. We decided to leave in the evening and make the drive all night to get to our destination. We were on the I-80, which is a 2-lane highway that passes through the mountains of Pennsylvania. This highway is far from safe. It's elevated in mountainous terrain. There are constant turns. It snakes around a lot. So if you go through the guardrail, you're flying down into the darkness of a ditch. Anyway, I'm driving while Jay is trying to get some sleep. I stop at a service plaza to refuel and run into the shop real quick to get some drinks and snacks for the road. It's a little past midnight, and I notice one other car refueling a few pumps from us. It was a red or burgundy SUV, I think a Mazda or a Suzuki, but I pay it, and the driver no mind as I ran back to the truck. Fast forward 30 minutes later, and I'm cruising on the left lane doing 90. Then I noticed the headlights behind us. It was the same red SUV from the service plaza. I first don't think nothing of it, but it dawned on me that this guy has been following since the service plaza. I decide to do a quick test to see if I'm being tailed or not. Since I was doing 90 consistently, I slowed down to 70 and waited to see if he passes me. The guy also slowed down with me, so now I'm on alert. I wake up Jay and tell him the situation. Bro, I think this guy is following us. My friend Jay is an ex-Army Ranger who is a lot more vigilant than me and also crazier. Immediately he says, "That's the car from the gas station. I noticed the guy was looking at you extra hard when you passed by him." Okay, switch lanes and see what he does. So I switch lanes and the SUV does so as well. Okay, slow down to a stop and pull over on the shoulder and see what he does. I listen to Jay and slow down to a complete stop on the shoulder of the highway. This fucking psycho slows down and parks behind us. "Wow, this guy has a lot of balls. He definitely has a gun on him," Jay exclaimed. "Okay, pull out and gun it to 90. I have an idea." Jay says I take stock with what we have in the truck that could be used as weapons. We had a hatchet and a machete, and each of us had a folding knife on us, but no firearms. I pull off the shoulder and stay in the right lane as I press down hard on the gas. Jay wants me to brake check the guy, so he crashes into the back of us and then charge the car with a machete and a hatchet and hope for the best. At this point, he isn't an active threat yet. If he tries to ram the truck or shoot at it, then it's a different story. But right now, I decided against it. Jay looks around the inside of the truck and grabs a high-powered handheld spotlight and opens the back window of the truck. Okay, I'm gonna light his ass up and see if we can get a good look at him. So he turns on the spotlight, and guess what? The guy's front windows are heavily tinted, so we can't get a look of his face. "Yo, Jay, I'm gonna switch lanes, see if you can aim at the side. Maybe his side windows aren't tinted." So I quickly swerve onto the left lane, and as I do that, Jay turns on the spotlight again. I make sure to turn my head toward the SUV at the same time. For the 3 seconds we had him illuminated, I will never forget the look of this guy. He was tall, at least over 6'3", because he was hunched over the steering wheel. He had the face of Uncle Fester from the Addams Family and the hair of Kramer from Seinfeld, along with a 5 o'clock shadow. Once he saw that I wasn't alone and that we know what he looks like, he turned at a truck rest stop area. To this day, me and Jay get into a debate about whether I should have brake checked the guy or not. He's under the impression that the guy was a serial killer and that he ended up finding another victim instead of being killed by us, possibly a trucker sleeping in his cab. I've analyzed this situation and concluded that this guy's intentions were deaf evil. How evil? Robbery at the minimum, kidnapping and murder at the worst. Thank God I was never able to find out. What do you all think? Just for context, I'm 17F and still attending school, so I work the same night shifts on Friday and midday weekend shifts every week. Around 5 months ago, I served a man who had come with his family during the weekend. He was really rude to me and my co-worker, constantly demanding extra stuff, claiming the food wasn't fresh. The food is made at the front bar, you can see it being made, and was also very strict to his family. Yelled at his kids to stand in a line and walk to wash their hands, yelling at them if they talked whilst eating. When he was beginning to leave, he randomly came back to me, guiding his crying daughter to tell me thank you for the food. She was clearly upset and embarrassed, trying to hide her face. A note about his family: he is a Middle Eastern man, but the wife and 3 kids ranging around 5. 12 were all Southeast Asian. The wife didn't speak English, but her kids did. Edit. I added this in because my friend pointed out I'm also Southeast Asian. I'm not trying to accuse him or certain races of things, but it's quite common in my area for men to prey on Asian girls. I didn't see him again until maybe 5 weeks ago. Every Friday when I work the night shift by myself, my other worker leaves 2 hours before closing, and all I have to do is the last bit of orders, then clean with the store closed and the lights off. He comes in to buy food but eats in store by himself. Each time he was being overly nice, but it felt so performative, like he would smile, give a compliment, then his face would drop and wait for my reaction. He creeped me out, but it wasn't any reason for concern until 2 weeks ago. He ate in again and left. Maybe an hour later, I closed up the store and cleaned, finishing around 11:30 p.m. I left through the back car park and went to the strip of stores across the road since I wanted to go to the bank and further down the street, separated by a crossing. The laundromat to wash the aprons since no one had bothered to do it before. When going to the bank, I saw the man again, waiting outside the bank on his phone. Didn't think anything of it. I saw him before, and it made sense to me that he was there. I walked past him without acknowledging him down the street until I noticed him following me. Each time I stopped, he would stop. If I randomly turned or crossed the road, doing random stuff to see if he would do the same, he was still there. He always kept a gap between us. When I reached the laundromat, he stood in front of the door just watching me. Not really knowing what to do since the laundromat is a long hallway, and not wanting to be face-to-face him when I came out the entry, I booked it for the fire escape on the opposite end, which lead to an alleyway surrounded by the sides of apartments. Took me ages to walk out of the alleyway until I reached the street where I could walk around the block of stores, back to the bank, and diagonal to the car park. I looked down the street again and didn't see him. I told my co-workers and boss about this. I no longer have the night shift and work Fridays after 4 p.m., and my co-workers have been keeping a lookout, but I haven't seen him since. Just for context, I'm 17F and still attending school, so I work the same night shifts on Friday and midday weekend shifts every week. Around 5 months ago, I served a man who had come with his family during the weekend. He was really rude to me and my co-worker, constantly demanding extra stuff, claiming the food wasn't fresh. The food is made at the front bar, you can see it being made, and was also very strict to his family. Yelled at his kids to stand in a line and walk to wash their hands, yelling at them if they talked whilst eating. When he was beginning to leave, he randomly came back to me, guiding his crying daughter to tell me thank you for the food. She was clearly upset and embarrassed, trying to hide her face. A note about his family: he is a Middle Eastern man, but the wife and 3 kids ranging around 5. 12 were all Southeast Asian. The wife didn't speak English, but her kids did. Edit. I added this in because my friend pointed out I'm also Southeast Asian. I'm not trying to accuse him or certain races of things, but it's quite common in my area for men to prey on Asian girls. I didn't see him again until maybe 5 weeks ago. Every Friday when I work the night shift by myself, my other worker leaves 2 hours before closing, and all I have to do is the last bit of orders, then clean with the store closed and the lights off. He comes in to buy food but eats in store by himself. Each time he was being overly nice, but it felt so performative, like he would smile, give a compliment, then his face would drop and wait for my reaction. He creeped me out, but it wasn't any reason for concern until 2 weeks ago. He ate in again and left. Maybe an hour later, I closed up the store and cleaned, finishing around 11:30 p.m. I left through the back car park and went to the strip of stores across the road since I wanted to go to the bank and further down the street, separated by a crossing. The laundromat to wash the aprons since no one had bothered to do it before. When going to the bank, I saw the man again, waiting outside the bank on his phone. Didn't think anything of it. I saw him before, and it made sense to me that he was there. I walked past him without acknowledging him down the street until I noticed him following me. Each time I stopped, he would stop. If I randomly turned or crossed the road, doing random stuff to see if he would do the same, he was still there. He always kept a gap between us. When I reached the laundromat, he stood in front of the door just watching me. Not really knowing what to do since the laundromat is a long hallway, and not wanting to be face to face him when I came out the entry, I booked it for the fire escape on the opposite end, which lead to an alleyway surrounded by the sides of apartments. Took me ages to walk out of the alleyway until I reached the street where I could walk around the block of stores, back to the bank, and diagonal to the car park. I looked down the street again and didn't see him. I told my co-workers and boss about this. I no longer have the night shift and work Fridays after 4 p.m., and my co-workers have been keeping a lookout, but I haven't seen him since. It was 2007, and I was 13. The new SmackDown v Raw WWE game had just come out, and I went into my small town on a Sunday morning to purchase it. After purchasing the game, I was in awe of the cover and the synopsis on the back of the game, so I sat on a bench to read it and take in the excitement of buying a new game. I lived in a small market town in England, so Sundays were often very quiet. While sitting on the bench, I looked over to the bus stop across the road and noticed a strange-looking scraggly man walking towards me. I was a bit nervous seeing this because, although I was 13/14, I looked about 11 as I was very small. On his approach, he asked me, "What's that you're holding?" I explained it was my new game. I then said, "Look, I need to go. My brother is waiting for me in the mall." Although he wasn't, I felt I needed to say this. As I walked off, the man began to follow me, asking my name and my age. I replied Lee, a fake name, and told him my age. On entering the mall, I started walking quicker and quicker, but I didn't want to start running as for some reason I wanted to save face. He kept asking if I had a girlfriend, and as he got closer, I noticed he had a scar down his face and lots of jewelry on. To his question, I responded yes, as I thought it may put him off if he knew I had a girlfriend. I then ran into a shop in the mall and started flicking through the magazines, but he persisted with the questions. I then got up courage to run as fast as I could. He began chase, but I got away. When I got home, I didn't tell my parents. I just went upstairs and played my game. But later that day, I told my mom. She called the police immediately. I then had to go to a police station local to myself and tell them what happened and pick him out of a number of photos the police had on laptop. Apparently, this man had kidnapped and raped many young boys. I was lucky enough, however, to escape. Edit asterisk. I later found out he was given 8 years in prison after a couple of boys he assaulted came forward. However, my evidence was not enough. When I was 12 years old, 2007, I was home alone babysitting my 2 younger siblings while my parents were out at an event. It was summertime, so it stayed light out for a while into the evening. Just as it was starting to get dark, I went into the kitchen to make a bowl of popcorn to watch a movie with my brother and sister. When I looked out the kitchen window, I saw that there was a car parked hiding in the tree line of our yard. For context, we live in a fairly rural place, and we rarely had people at our direction unless they lived down our gravel road and we knew our neighbors' cars. This was a junky beater, and the license plates had been taped over. It was not one of our neighbors. I was a kid who was pretty aware of my surroundings, and I decided to step back from the big kitchen window and go into the dark entryway hall to get a better look. There was just a single man sitting in it, staring directly at the house with the lights off. Immediately, I locked the front and back door. I told my little brother and sister calmly to play in their room and not to come out until I came and got them for movie night. I then went back to the kitchen to get the phone to call my mom, but she didn't answer. I watched him through the curtains sit in the dark tree line and stare at the house for what felt like ages. Finally, someone drove down our road and their headlights reflected off the car. He started the engine, drove out of the trees, and booked it down the gravel. I was still very nervous and tried calling my mom again. No answer. So for the rest of the time, I just played with my siblings in their room with the door shut and curtains pulled until my parents came home later that night. When I tried telling my parents what had happened, they were convinced I was making it up and that I was being a dramatic kid. I swore up and down I saw this car with blacked out plates in the tree line, and they weren't interested at all. I know I saw it, but I'm the only one who did. Maybe it was just a random guy who didn't know there were 3 young kids home alone hiding for some other reason. But I'm still glad I locked all the doors. I've had a few good encounters over the years, but today I'll share this one in particular. So this happened back in my late teens. I was likely around 16, 17, pre-transition, years old when this happened. Growing up, I was always a bit of a recluse and kept to myself. My friend circle was small, and I was bullied over everything under the sun. Pretty stereotypical shy, introverted, and troubled kid. I also grew up pretty straight-laced. My parents and older sibling had addictions to smoking, drinking, and harder drugs. To me, I had actively seen what it did to people and decided early on to stay away from those things as much as possible. When I got to my older teens, I loosened up a little bit but still didn't really partake. Smoked a cigarette once, hated it. Drank beer once, hated it. My mom was always really open when it came to if her kids wanted to experiment. She would always say, "If you're going to smoke/drink, I'd prefer that you do it in the house instead of at a party or with friends." Luckily for her, I was a pretty mild-mannered child compared to my elder and younger siblings, so that meant that if I ever wanted to try something, she was pretty open to letting me get away with it. So when it came to New Year's Eve, I had interest in trying a mixed drink. Like mentioned above, I had tried a sip of beer and absolutely hated it, but I did think fruity drinks would be good. Specifically interested in trying a fuzzy navel. My mom obliged, grabbed some for herself to have, and made me one drink to enjoy during the night. Since I didn't have friends to hang out with, nor did I care much for the end of one crappy year shifting into the next, I just spent my time as I usually did, which was to play video games. I had been lucky enough to have my own TV and console in my room to play whenever I wanted to. But because I was a paranoid kid with little experience in drinking, I wanted to be downstairs where my family was near. I was close to the only bathroom in the house in case I needed to throw up. I lugged my PS2 downstairs and set myself up in our sunroom. This was during a cold winter, and when I lived where there was snow, so I was essentially in a fishbowl. 3 of the 4 walls were lined with half-wall glass, side by side, looking out into the darkness of the country night. On the far left of the room, where I was maybe 3 feet away from, was a door that led outside. The sunroom faces the road, which is maybe 30, 40 feet away. I fired up the kerosene heater, wrapped myself in blankets with my little drink, and delved into some RPG. I had my one drink and spent a couple of hours playing video games. It was likely close to midnight because I remember celebrating with the rest of my family in the main part of the house after this. But I was sitting in a dark room with the light of the TV illuminating me, and was pretty much in that fishbowl. Like any good gamer, I was fully invested in what was happening on the screen, so I have no idea how long they were there for. Out of the corner of my eye, I heard a sudden noise, the slap of a hand harshly against a window glass. With it being both winter and an old house, the glass made a strange wobbly noise. I immediately jumped and darted my eyes toward the sound. However, from looking at a bright screen in a dark room for hours to suddenly trying to figure out what was going on while looking at a dark window, my eyes did this weird thing where I couldn't really make out any features. I just saw a pale white guy grinning really intensely. I like to believe that I tend to react decently well in panic situations. Shortly after making himself known, like maybe 2 seconds, he took off. I shoved myself up from my spot as he began to run away, went 2 rooms over to where my elder brother was playing on his computer, and shakily told him that a guy was outside the window and just scared me. He immediately grabbed his gun and ran outside. Armed with my brother, I also went outside with him. I'm ridiculously curious and can get really bolstered when I have support. The pair of us went out and around the house. We saw the footsteps in the snow, a track from the road to the window, and then a more rushed pair away from the house. However, we saw no person. We also didn't see or hear any cars. Even when I first stood up after being scared, I didn't see a car's headlights. Obviously, after this, I just went back inside and decided I was no longer going to be playing video games at night in the sunroom anymore. I spent the rest of the night in a well-lit room surrounded by family and celebrated the new year properly with a second drink. There's just so many weird thoughts to this that I've thought of over the years. Who was out at that time? Was he drunk? Was he driving drunk and decided this was going to be a funny prank? Or was he just walking around at 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve in the country? Did he just have an impulse moment because he could see a light on in a relatively dark home? How long was he watching me? What else was he doing while he was watching me? What was the point of scaring me? Just for the reaction? I saw his hand, heard the sound of that slap. Why didn't he have any gloves? If he had a car, did he park his car in the driveway, or was his car just turned off in the middle of the street so he could do this? He was only 2 windows length away from the door that led to me. Had he had any darker intentions, he could have easily opened that door and gotten inside. My parents were listening to some TV show loudly in their room, way over on the other side of the house, and my brother always plays on the computer with noise-canceling headphones. This is the part that scares me the most, even though it obviously never happened, was likely never his intention, and this all was probably just a prank. Sometimes the thought of what could have happened is scarier than the actual scare. Not knowing the intentions behind someone's thoughts and actions is what gets to me. Do you ever feel like you're being watched? It can happen when you're alone or with others. You feel this indescribable primal emotion, sort of like a mental itch that just tells you you're being stalked by something. This is exactly how I felt on the drive into Huron-Manistee National Forest. For those unfamiliar, it's a beautiful and massive park that's bordered almost entirely by Lake Michigan. I have many fond memories of my experiences here, but the story I'm about to share falls into a different category. I was with my girlfriend of about 6 months at the time, who will alias Diane. She was driving as we pulled off the interstate and neared the smaller roads that led into the designated camping area of the park. Originally, we planned to set up our campsite in the aforementioned spot, but upon arrival we noticed how crowded it was. After a bit of deliberating, we opted to grab our camping gear, which was only a minimalist tent, a few days' worth of food, and some bottled water, and we hiked a mile or so inland, away from where the other campers were situated. After all, we came out here to have some intimacy, and being surrounded by strangers cracking beers and partying did not fit the bill. It was around 6 o'clock when we finally arrived at a suitable campground. It was a clearing just up a small hill, about 15 meters in diameter, surrounded by thick woods on every side, including where we entered from. We first heard it as we were setting up the tent, a thick, deliberate scream, reminiscent of an animal in a great deal of pain. It rang out across the clearing. "What the hell?" Diane muttered. The sound ended as abruptly as it started, and almost as if in a cartoon, a flock of birds in the trees overhead took off, all flying back the direction we had come from. "What was that?" I asked, a barely noticeable quiver in my voice. "I don't know, maybe a deer or something." After giving her theory, Diane continued pitching the tent, and I did too, though I found the sound hard to shake. After the tent was set up, Diane suggested we better hurry and get some firewood, as since we weren't at the designated campground, there was no existing fire pit. I remember saying that I thought I saw good material just outside the clearing on our way in, when a strange noise came from overhead. It was gone in an instant. It sounded like a very large bird swooping just over where our tent was. We both heard it, and immediately looked up and around the area, though we couldn't see the thing that made the sound. Whatever kind of bird it was, we didn't know. All we could tell was that it was fast and big. Fast forward a few hours, and the sun was setting. After a rather grueling wood haul, we were able to get a proper fire going, and we were stereotypically toasting marshmallows over the flame, while casually flirting and telling ghost stories. As I was biting into my charred sweet, we heard the scream again. This time it was a lot closer. The noise rang out in a way that made my ears throb, and I had to cover them with my hands. It lasted longer this time too, going about 4 or 5 seconds. Diane stood up. "What is that?" she yelled, as if trying to ask whatever made the scream. Though the sound was unnerving, I was more annoyed than scared at that point. "A real a-hole of a deer," we both laughed. "I swear if it does that while I'm asleep, I'm just gonna scream back." Our jokes dissolved the tension pretty quickly, and we went back to toasting our marshmallows, watching the sky dissolve from purple into a deep ocean blue. The rest of that night was uneventful until we went to sleep. Sometime around 12 or 1 in the morning, I woke up to a loud thud outside, as if something heavy was dropped. "What was that?" She was still groggy, so I jostled her with my arm. "Diane, wake up. I think something's outside." "What? What do you mean?" "An animal or something." She just continued to lie there, so I said something to get her attention. "I'm scared." She sat up in the tent, and I could see with my phone flashlight that she was very tired. "Ugh, okay, you want me to go look?" I guess." Without complaining, she got out of the sleeping bag, taking with her my phone, and exited the tent. "Hello? Anything out here?" she called jokingly as she shined her flashlight around the clearing. I watched her from the tent as she walked into the center of it, illuminating the area with the phone. Then, near the edge of the clearing, she spotted something. "Whoa, hey, see, come here." I squinted, realizing I could barely see, and reached back to grab my glasses before getting out of the tent and walking over to her. This might sound strange, but the air felt heavy, like it does before a thunderstorm. There was also this faint smell of copper. It grew stronger as I went over to her. Looking where she was shining the light, I saw what looked like a young fawn. At first I thought it was sleeping, completely unaware of us, until I saw the markings on its back. Deep in its fur, there were these gouges, about 2 feet apart, that were darkened, obviously soaked with blood. It looked almost as if the deer was picked up by some sort of predatory bird. I found this confusing, as I couldn't think of a bird of prey able to lift an animal that easily weighed 50 pounds up into the air. "What the hell?" I said aloud. Even stranger, though, was the fact that the only markings on the animal were on its back. There were no other wounds, so whatever had done this to the deer didn't feed off of it at all. It just killed it and left. "Babe, I really don't like this." Diane wrapped her arm around me, pulling me to her. I know, let's get back to the tent. We'll get out of here as soon as the sun comes up." I nodded slowly, and we both began walking back to the tent. A few footfalls back, though, we heard the sound of a twig snapping. Diane shined the flashlight behind us, revealing nothing at first. She scanned the tree line, and to my horror, we saw something. Directly in front of us, maybe 20 feet away, was a large humanoid figure. It glared at us, and whether it was cause of the flashlight or this thing's natural disposition, its eyes appeared to be bright red, glowing orbs. I was horrified. If I had to guess, I'd say the thing was between 8 and 10 feet tall. It was feathered in a deep gray coat. It stood staring at us. It didn't seem to have a separated head, but rather, its eyes were just plastered to the top of its body, sort of like an owl. Both me and my partner were stunned as we looked onto the thing. It was then that it extended its arms or wings, revealing a very wide span that seemed to flow from the entirety of its body, much like a moth. Without warning, it screamed at us. The sound was unbearable, thick, heavy, and blood-curdling, like a fire alarm amplified by 100. I collapsed to the forest floor, clutching my ears as Diane held me. The last thing I remember was her saying my name as my vision faded to black. When I awoke, I was in the back of our car. I was surprised and sat straight up. Diane spotted me in the rearview mirror. "I'm glad you're awake." As she spoke, I noticed my ears were ringing a great deal. I clutched my head in pain. What the hell happened? I grew pale in the face, remembering the creature from the night before. She kept her eyes on the road as she spoke. "The thing, it took off almost as soon as you blacked out, like a jet. It was crazy. I took you back to the tent and waited until it was dawn before I booked it." "You mean you carried me all that way?" "I tried to wake you up a few times, but you were out cold. It wasn't too bad anyway, but I had to leave the tent." I sighed before nodding slowly. "Money we'll never get back." I paused. "And thank you for protecting me." I saw her smile in the rearview mirror without another word. To this day, we're still together. As strange as it is, that event seemed to bring us closer. We talk about it often, using it as an anecdote when friends come over. It's a very healthy way to process an ordeal like that. We've been living together for quite some time now, and I see marriage as a very realistic future for us. As for the creature itself, I'm still unsure what it was. Based on its behavior and its striking physical form, I'd guess that we encountered the Mothman, a humanoid cryptid that's said to have the body of a moth with glowing red eyes. According to folklore, it's commonly seen as an omen before a major disaster. I still think about that night often. Honestly, I don't know if I'd still be alive right now to write this story if it wasn't for my partner. Please stay safe when you're out in the woods. You never can be sure what you'll see out there. I live in a small neighborhood in Cordova, South Carolina, near Orangeburg, with my mom, my adopted dad, and my younger sister. My mom, sister, and I lived in Barnwell for the most part until my mom began dating my adoptive dad before getting engaged in December 2017. By 2019, we moved in with him, and I have lived here long enough to know that, aside from the people my dad is friends with that also live in the neighborhood, there are people who live within the ayat that can be trusted to say the least, and one of them being my neighbor from next door. For as long as I have lived here, I knew that all he was rake leaves, burn stuff, leave, and sticks even on the hottest days, mow his lawn even though there was not much grass in it, and feed the stray cats, all while staying quiet throughout the day. But at some point he began spying on our other neighbors as well, and my mom told me that one night he was spying on one of the neighbors in their yard while they were having a party, causing my dog to bark at him even though he wasn't in our yard, and his creepy ways led to one of the neighbors that live across the street from him to move away, and the house has been left untouched ever since, and the only ones who have touched it are cats and dogs that live within the neighborhood itself. One day my dog got out and me and my mom had to chase him all around the neighborhood, and during the chase, he ran into the neighbor's yard and he was trying to grab him, which is something my mom and I hoped would not happen, which it didn't. But then, one day when my sister and I came back home from our grandmother's, a little bit of an argument broke out between my parents and the neighbor. Kids who lived within the neighborhood were riding around in golf carts, and the neighbor went out of his way to shoot the kids, where for the very first time he said that he had, quote, every right to do so. Like he had some sort of authority or something, and the cops came soon enough, but then they let him go because they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest, so they just let him off the hook that day. All of this led to us believing that he was a deranged, mentally unstable man, and I had even told my mom numerous times that if he were to spy on us or walk in our yard, I would be the first one to call the cops on him. And I also have a 7-month-old black German Shepherd training to become a therapy dog and service dog who knows that he's danger. Because one day when he was walking around the neighborhood, he stopped and looked at the neighbor's house, and the hairs on his back stood up, showing that even he didn't trust the neighbor and knew that he was a threat. But just now my mom told me that highway patrol came, and he, my mom and dad, had a heart-to-heart conversation about everything, and he apologized for what he has done. And if he scared us any, the reason he acts like this is because he is practically done with everyone in the neighborhood's stupidity and the crap that goes down, which I kinda don't blame him for because of what goes down every single day. Though it might take me a while to believe that he is a trustworthy person. Although he has just now apologized for his past actions, I will have to believe it when I see it for myself. This for real happened to me the first time I moved out of my own years ago. I know that you readers, listeners, will find it unbelievable, but I'm telling this story because I'm hoping it will help with my nightmares about it. After graduating high school, I was determined to gain my independence. My parents were decently normal parents, but I wanted that freedom so much. By 19, I got a steady, decent job at a local factory. I bought a gently used car. I was ready to start looking for a place. A lot of the places I looked at didn't accept persons under 21, though. I carried on my search for weeks. I saw the sign driving into the city that posted available studio apartments. I called the number straight away. The apartment manager was also the owner. She did a thorough investigation on me and decided that even though I was so young, she trusted me to be her tenant. I was elated and moved right in that next week. I got settled in really quickly. I was so happy to have my own place. I greeted all of my neighbors that I passed. I became acquainted with almost everyone. I had my usual routine of checking my mailbox after I got off work. Everyone's mailbox was at the side entrance to the complex. So I was casually walking to the group of mailboxes when I noticed that the lawyer guy, Mr. Gray, standing on the sidewalk about 50 feet away, looking alarmingly disheveled and confused. At first I didn't recognize him because this man was always wearing a suit or stylishly dressed, perfectly clean-shaven and styled hair to go with it. I ran into him at least 3 times a week. He always greeted me with a smile and a warm greeting. Dumbfounded, I put my hand up for a wave. Taking a closer look at him, his hair looked slept on and his clothes were mismatched and looked slept on. I stood there waiting for a wave back. He just stood there looking at me with a clueless and dead-eyed stare. I stopped mid-wave when he began walking toward me. His gait was off balance, staggering. I took a few steps back, holding my mail. "Mr. Gray, are you all right?" I yelled out. As he came closer, I backed in fear. The mail dropped from my hands, thinking to myself, "Dude, what the F is going on?" and was frozen in confusion. He looked at me with blank eyes, unwavering as he walked across the parking lot. His face looked literally lifeless. As he staggered closer, I had backed myself up to the entrance of the flights of stairs leading to the first floor of the apartments. I was so freaked that I didn't turn my back to him and started backwards up the stairs. Adrenaline kicked in and I sprinted up the stairs. I got to the stop and tripped over my feet at the last stair. I looked behind me for a second and his pace had picked up. He was at the start of the stairs now, only about 12 steps in between us. I saw how his pupils were so dilated that there was no color. Scared out of my mind, I flew up the second set of stairs and had my keys ready. I panicked while unlocking the door. I was shaking so bad it seemed like forever until I was inside. I locked both locks on the door, feeling like collapsing from pure terror. I felt like I was having a heart attack with my hands uncontrollably shaking. I grabbed for my phone inside my pocket. I dialed 911. The operator answered, but I didn't have the words to explain. Hell, I didn't even know what had just happened. I just knew that the situation had felt wrong. Something is wrong with one of my neighbors. I think an ambulance should come and check on him. After saying that, my grasp on the phone slipped out of my hands. I was in shock, waiting for Mr. Gray to come and find me. I stood there facing the door for some time, completely silent, and with no knocks or bangs on my door, my hand stopped shaking and my heart rate slowed. "The EMTs will take care of him," I said to myself. I turned the TV on for background noise and relaxed on the couch. The next morning there was a knock on the front door. I immediately checked the peephole. It was the nice middle-aged lady that lived to the left of my apartment. I opened the door and greeted her. She never really said much to me except casual conversation when we caught each other out. She had a troubled look on her faces. She started with, "Good morning, hun. I came over here to see if you knew about what happened with Mr. Gray. You know, the man who lives on the 3rd floor, always wears a suit and very mannerly." "Yeah." I still felt disheveled about what happened. "Well, I got up early this morning before dawn and saw flashing red and blue lights on the street. They were parked on the street outside of one of the houses across from us. I decided to walk over there and find out what was happening. People were crowded around the police cars. I asked one of our neighbors what in the world was going on. He told me that a person walking their dog saw a man coming out the front door of that house. He was covered in blood. He had a bloody knife in his hand and his clothes were spattered with blood. Even worse, the bottom of his face had blood dripping down. I staggered back and fell against the wall. I couldn't believe it. I mean, this was absolutely crazy, unbelievable. I felt a shock run through me from pure horror. A few weeks after I had nightmares every night, I had processed what had happened, like what led to him losing his mind like that. I had so many questions but no answers. No one would talk about it, and there was no public report out yet. Worst of all, I blamed myself for not calling the cops. A few weeks later, the newspaper updated everyone. The title was, "A well-respected lawyer kills 2 women inside their home." It went on to say that in the middle of the night he gained entry through the sliding glass door and attacked them. When asked why he did it, he said that the voices inside his head had been talking to him for days. He claimed the aliens. Before that day he lost control of his mind and body, that they made him look for whoever was in his path to brutally kill them and consume their blood. Nothing was made public after that. I mean, what does one even say about what happened? Sometimes I still dream about it, and I think I always will. This world is effing crazy. I was accepted to my dream university and started my freshman year at the naive age of 18. I was 2 hours from home, but still in the same state, and no one from my cornfield of a town attended the same university. I was so excited for a fresh start, but also pretty nervous to be away from my family and my home. The university wasn't any Ivy League place, but it did offer both degrees I wanted for a double major. Anyhow, the dorms for freshmen were subpar, and they had communal bathrooms. If you have ever shared a bathroom with a bunch of women, you'll know why communal bathrooms are a mistake. My randomly assigned roommate never showed up to the college, and for the first month or so I had a small room to myself. These rooms were just big enough for 2 twin beds and 2 small wardrobes, so I was glad for the extra space and privacy, since curtains and walls between the beds were not allowed. My peace was shattered one day when I was woken up from a nap between classes to the RA unlocking the door with 2 women in tow. The daughter, a college freshman like me, was very loud, energetic, and extroverted, whereas her mother was reserved, quiet, and seemed ready to leave. I learned that they had given her the empty bed and she'd be moving in. Great, no more privacy, and my nap was interrupted, but I knew the no-show would be replaced eventually. Let's call this new roommate Tia. I am an introvert and face medical conditions that leave me in chronic pain and fatigue, so her hyper-personality was a bit overwhelming at first, but she was in the same major as my first degree, so I hoped to at least be friends. Yeah, that hope didn't last long. She had a wind instrument that she decided to use constantly in that tiny room. She could not play a single note, and it sounded like a literal banshee, but the RA eventually had enough and shoved her outside with the wannabe flute every time after that. Then came the mace incident. I am a small person who at the time was barely 5 feet and 100 pounds, so yeah, I carried mace. I had a mace pen and a mace sprayer, and she asked to borrow a pen. She hit the wrong button and released the whole canister in the room. Did I mention the vents in the building were connected for each floor? The building was promptly evacuated for a couple of hours to be aired out, and my bed sheets were less than salvageable. Still, I assumed Tia wasn't malicious, just a little airheaded until the phone calls started. Tia was dating a football player from a different university, but regularly used Tinder to find other guys to piss the boyfriend off. In fact, she left me in the room with these random Tinder guys on speakerphone to go shower all the time. Her phone was always on speaker mode with the volume maxed out, and it became increasingly obvious Tia did not have an inside voice. This lasted for hours every day and every night. Sleep was becoming scarce, and I begged her to step in the stairwell or something at least. I think that made it worse because she started watching movies on full blast until the witching hours, and even fell asleep with her phone still playing. I no longer liked The Lion King after being kept awake by it for weeks. Then her boyfriend threatened to show up to murder me because I begged her to knock it off with the noise, as did our neighbors. I reported him to his school's police department and learned he was suspended from classes and football. This is when things escalated from inconsiderate to evil. I locked my medication in a safe because I didn't trust anyone, and I started to find dents, scratches, and damage to the safe as if someone was trying to open it. My clothes were showing signs of being rummaged through. She dumped her trash on my bed every day. She ruined my microwave and mini fridge, and I started getting sicker and sicker and sicker. I stopped eating anything that had been in the dorm and stopped buying groceries. I stuck to meals I purchased in the cafeteria and started feeling better. Weird, but maybe I was stressed, right? Wrong. The RA found bleach and rat poison under my roommate's bed after other girls started complaining of stomach-related issues whenever they accepted food from her. She was poisoning us a little at a time, but covering everything with so many spices we couldn't tell. I freaked out and called the university police, who did nothing. She started assaulting me in my sleep. Punches, tickles, slaps, whatever she could do in passing, even if I wasn't asleep. I was miserable and desperate to escape, and even contemplated jumping from the famous 12-story library we had at the university. My final week of the semester, I broke down and stayed in a hotel room before my final exam just to sleep. I moved everything out with me, and the RA did a final check to see she had torn open everything that could have possible had my stuff left in it. Even the bare twin mattress was thrown off the bed springs. Needless to say, I was given a private room when I returned the next semester, and I never knew what happened to Tia. I heard she terrorized roommates at other universities, but I have no idea if that is true. I still can hardly believe some stranger poisoned me for asking her to turn down the volume. Not can I understand why her boyfriend, who I never met, was ready to murder me because his cheating girlfriend didn't like me. Even accusations of racism were thrown in, but quickly dismissed when it was uncovered that the only ones slinging slurs were Tia and her boyfriend. I have diagnosed PTSD now and slept with a taser for months. Even now, I still have moments of pure panic when I see the most mundane things because of my brief living situation. My microwave, fridge, and safety lockbox didn't survive, and we actually had to use a crowbar to retrieve my medications from the extent of the damage. I know this story sounds insane, and some of you are probably wondering why the RA, the police, and the university didn't do anything, and honestly, I don't know why they didn't. The university covered up many incidents that occurred on the campus and downplayed many deaths and other issues while I was there, so maybe it was to avoid a PR issue. Thankfully, the professors were very understanding and kept a close eye on her for the few classes we shared that semester. Still, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away, and I pray I'll never see her again. The following event I'm about to tell you happened during the beginning of the pandemic. Now you must remember the pandemic came as such a shock to the world when it first started that people, rightfully so, felt anxious, flustered, and on guard. But it wasn't just anxiety that seemed to spread throughout the general public. Things felt almost up in the air, like our perceptions of what a structured society should be were less concrete, and chaos seemed more plausible than it once was. It was probably due to the aforementioned shock of the pandemic, combined with the lengthy periods of isolation that made people this way. But I could be wrong, as this is just my perception of how I viewed the world. Well, let's just say you'll get a better picture as to why I think this way after hearing about my trip to the hospital on April 17, 2020. I was locked up in my small studio apartment in Brookline, Boston on the week of the 17th, attempting to sip from a mug of some herbal tea with honey, and propped up on a couple of pillows watching episodes of Twin Peaks on my laptop since trying to fall asleep was out of the question at that point. My nose was running like a faucet, my head felt like it was being pumped with helium, and my throat was so painful that even the act of taking a small sip of tea induced pain that was on par with being branded with a hot iron. Fearing the worst but trying to deny it, I knew eventually I would need to see a doctor or some medical professional. At any earlier point in my life, I could probably just sweat out whatever I was suffering from. But at the beginning of a pandemic, where the only news you see on TV is about a respiratory virus infecting thousands of people by the hour, getting tested was out of the question. Not only for my own safety, but for others as well. The thing is, I was definitely worried I had the virus, but was so afraid I'd be taken away by men in white hazmat suits to an unknown futuristic-looking government-owned laboratory to be tested on, then disposed of, that even calling a doctor to let them know that I'm having symptoms of a virus was intimidating. This was Thursday night. Come Friday morning, after a sleepless night of seeing pink elephants dancing around me and feeling on the edge of death, I decided not to screw around anymore and get medical attention. I didn't want to call an ambulance because that may have been a little over the top, plus expensive as hell, so I asked my friend Alex to drive me to the local hospital, by far the best hospital in Boston and one of the top in the world. By the way, all the names of the people in this story, including my own, are fictitious for privacy reasons. The thought of being able to go to a world-renowned hospital to be seen by outstanding doctors and nurses was such a blessing and put me a little at ease. I stared out the backseat window of Alex's Toyota Corolla at the now empty Commonwealth Avenue. Being a senior undergraduate at Boston University at the time, I lived off campus. The sight was truly bizarre, as every day thousands of students would make the routine trek up and down this windy street, going from building to building, where they'd see even more people. Now, the emptiness of the streets felt very eerie to me, as if the soul of the city left and in its place stood hollow buildings and streets. When we got to the hospital, Alex dropped me off at the emergency entrance, where there was a makeshift tent set up outside with a couple of employees in white full-body medical suites. As I stepped up to the table where they were sitting, one of them got up and used a handgun thermometer to take my temperature. They then looked at the readout, and without asking for any personal details, ushered me into the building. I immediately was overwhelmed by the complete chaos that was the hospital inside. There were sickly people strewn out through the hospital's entrance. Frantic-looking nurses with face shields were running everywhere back and forth between departments, some taking time to talk with or examine people in the waiting area, others transporting patients on gurneys through the double-doored emergency entrance. The ease I felt about being in the doctor's safe hands earlier was fading away as a feeling of dread set in, and with it the intensity of my symptoms. I had to sit down as I started to feel faint, but luckily within a few moments of doing so, a nurse came up to me and gently grabbed my arm to steady me. "Easy does it," the nurse said into my ear. Her words felt as if they were really close then, really far off, and I didn't realize how faint I felt until she touched my arm. My vision started to go a little fuzzy, and the nurse laid me back on the chair as I saw her simultaneously waving to what must have been her colleagues off in the distance. Sir, are you with me?" a stern voice called out to me in the distance. I wanted to respond, but everything seemed far away, and it felt better to just stay where I was and let the long-needed rest I could feel coming on sweep me away into a sweet state of tranquility. When I woke up, I noticed the setting had changed. The chaotic sounds of the emergency room had subsided, and I was once again alone in a bed, this time propped up with an IV needle injected into the inside of my right arm, connected to a pouch of clear liquid hanging from a metal stand. I looked around at my environment to take everything in. There was a drawn curtain in front of me, and I seemed to be in a closed room as there was no noise aside from the occasional beeps from the monitor to my left, displaying my heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen saturation. There was a sink and some cabinets to the front left of my bed, and a closed door next to it that was either a bathroom or linen closet. To my disappointment, I couldn't find a TV anywhere I could watch to take my mind off the pain I was in, so I was left alone to the reality of my situation. Something useful I did see was a whiteboard above the sink that displayed the name Anita Rosario under nurse and Chris Greenfield under PA. It also had a section that read tests taken with NA marked underneath, blood type with O positive written, and to my enormous relief, negative was marked under the COVID status section. I was so relieved that I exhaled and immediately felt the burn in my throat and the soreness throughout my body. So I wasn't out of the woods left. I assumed that I would be tested for other viruses before being sent on my way. Within seconds of that thought, I could hear the door open up, and two people came into my room, sliding the curtains out of the way and coming into view. A tall, almost cowering man wearing a light blue lab coat and blue face mask with friendly-looking dark eyes and a side-parted haircut walked in, followed by a short blonde woman wearing similar attire, pushing a silver metallic cart in front of her loaded with what looked like a syringe, a long thin wire, and a bunch of thin transparent tubes loaded on a tray. Before casually glancing at the whiteboard to the right of him and walking towards the foot of my bed, the man said, "Hello there, young man. My name's Dr. Grenfield, and this is my assistant nurse Rosario. You must be Dimitri, yes?" I nodded. "You're in quite the state, Dimitri, passing out in the lobby and now hooked up to an IV tube. But hey, at least you don't have COVID, right?" he said, then laughed, lightly bumping me in the foot. I half laughed, half grimaced. I didn't think this was how doctors typically treated patients, at least in my state. I shrugged it off, though, as him just being a bit cavalier, since guys like that seemed to be well dispersed throughout Boston. He then came over to my left to examine the monitors. "Unfortunately, your blood pressure seems pretty high, especially for a young guy of your stature, and your oxygen saturation isn't too great," he noted as the nurse came around my other side and forced open my mouth to take my temperature. I tried to let her put the thermometer under my tongue, but she kind of jabbed it pretty hard and took it out within a couple of seconds. I massaged my cheek with my hand, a bit disgruntled and frustrated that she couldn't have just used a thermometer gun the nurses at the emergency entrance used earlier to take my temperature. 103.5, the nurse said in a slightly bored-sounding voice. "Thank you. All right, Dimitri, due to your persistent symptoms and despite the antibiotic you've been getting through the IV, we're going to have to run some tests on you to get some answers as to what's causing your suffering. That all right with you?" he asked. But before I could answer, he signaled to the nurse and she took the liquid IV out as she began setting up to do what looked like drawing blood. "This shouldn't take too long, Dmitri. We just want to find out what's making you so sick," he continued, with what almost seemed like a smirk forming under his mask. This whole setup started to make me feel uncomfortable. Why was this doctor acting so nonchalant during such a hectic time? He surely had a million other patients he was dealing with. And the nurse didn't seem stressed, like the ones I saw in the lobby. If anything, she seemed almost aggressive, which she showed when taking my temperature and removing my IV. And there was something else that just didn't feel right. Little things I couldn't bring to the surface of my mind, but bothersome nonetheless. "Flex," the nurse said as he put pressure on the area of my arm right under my bicep. I clenched as she whipped down the area where the previous puncture was visible with an alcohol prep pad and attached one of the clear plastic tubes to the wire connected to the needle. A tight light green rubber band was then tied around my bicep. "So, are you in college?" the doctor said as I felt a sharp piercing pain in my arm. I winced and responded, "Year, a senior." "Not the way you'd imagine your senior spring to go, eh? What a pisser. You're probably not going to have a graduation either, I guess. Well, at least not in person." "You're probably right," I said, slowly shifting my attention away from the pain and sensation of the blood leaving my arm. Although my college days weren't the best, at least I'm not living through a damn pandemic. I mean, hell, the college in Serbia I went to back in the 90s couldn't even be considered school at some points due to the war and all, he said. Well, that explained his accent I couldn't identify. As someone with Balkan roots, I was a bit confused as to why his name was Chris Greenfield or whatever he said. Life was really brutal back then, more so than anything you Americans would ever have gone through. You had to learn to survive on your own, even if that meant doing things that weren't in yours or others' best interest. War shows people's other side, their darker side, and the lengths they'd go to keep themselves alive. In fact, I learned that sometimes in life you have to do some ugly things to get by, but at the end of the day, if it keeps you and your loved ones safe, that's all that matters. I found everything he was saying disconcerting, but the ability to string together a thought was slowly becoming harder and harder. I could feel the faintness coming on again, but this time it was as if I was slowly being drained of all energy. I had the taste of metal in my mouth. Breaking my attention from the doctor, I looked at my arms and saw how pale they were. I weakly turned my head to look at the nurse taking my blood, and was stunned to see at least 25 vials of my dark blood placed on a tray. How could she have taken so much blood so fast? "Don't look at her, Dmitri. Look at me," the doctor said, physically moving my head so that I was looking at him. "This is the hard part, but it's easier if you ignore looking. You see, life and your perception of it is really just made up of what you focus on. Why focus on your blood being drawn? Why not focus instead on—" But I felt as if I was slipping away from consciousness again. I tried to hold on, but boy, was it hard. I tried moving my limbs, but they felt like heavy sandbags weighing me down. In the distance, I could hear a loud, continuing beeping going off. My eyes started to close, but I used every last ounce of energy to keep them open. It felt as if my life depended on it. And based on what the doctor said, I was correct, because my attention to my surroundings was what determined what my reality was. So if I focused hard on trying to keep that attention strong, reality would stay intact. But as I tried harder and harder, it felt like I was fighting with the very own cosmos itself to keep reality intact. Black pouches were filling my vision, muffled voices sounded more and more like a background buzz, and my body felt like it was floating up into space, unbound by any physical restraints keeping me down. My sense of reality came back into consciousness for a bit as I could faintly feel the sharp prick of something in my right arm and hear rapid feet shuffling around me. Then I heard what sounded like the door slam. Within a few moments, the faint feeling settled back in, and I could only partially make out the sound of some people coming in through the door. I then felt some vague sensations on my body, and I fell back into a deep sleep. "Dmitri, can you hear me?" a voice off in the distance asked. As I slowly came around, my surroundings came into focus. The faint, distant hum turned into sounds of beeping monitors and moving feet. The blurry images sharpened into focus, showing one nurse taking vitals and another patting my forehead with a warm washcloth. My throat felt like the Sahara Desert, and despite being hooked up to a liquid IV machine, I asked for a cup of water. A nurse promptly brought me a small Dixie cup, and I downed it within seconds of her handing it to me. The numb feelings throughout my body were unfortunately also fading away as sensation took its place, and I winced as a sharp stabbing pain shot throughout my head as I turned to look at the man standing in front of me. This was definitely not the person that I saw before, as this guy had lighter hair and was considerably smaller. Dimitri, I'm your attending physician's assistant, Chris Greenfield. The nurses and I came in a while ago when we got a notification that your vitals were dropping to dangerous levels. We saw you in bed, alone, and you were passed out with a noticeable amount of blood smeared on your right arm. I wasn't sure of the situation I just walked into, but immediately surmised, based on your vitals and other details, that you had lost a lot of blood and were at risk of what we call exsanguination, which is death by blood loss. We quickly began a blood transfusion to restabilize you, and we're very lucky to do so. But I gotta tell you, Dimitri, it's a miracle that you're alive. If we'd arrived any later, it's most likely that you would have been beyond saving. I felt a sense of shock as the doctor said this. I came to the hospital worried I was going to die of a million different things, but blood loss wasn't one of them. I replied in a croaky voice, but felt a wave of dizziness and decided it was better to save my energy for the time being. Don't worry, Dimitri, you don't have to talk, but soon your vitals will return to normal, and the medication we've been giving will restore your energy so you can cooperate with us and tell us what the hell happened. For now, you can nod or shake your head if you'd like in response to anything I or someone else says. I awkwardly nodded my head in response, despite feeling a twinge of pain throughout my upper body. I felt 100x worse than when I came to this place, but I also wanted to get to the bottom of whatever the hell happened. So we first want to confirm that this wasn't a suicide attempt. I know this is a blunt question, but the evidence is pretty clear you didn't come here to kill yourself. Can you just confirm with a slight nod or thumbs up? Due to my excruciating headache, I gave a thumbs up. Good. Now can you confirm that you weren't the one who was responsible for taking blood from your arm? Again, thumbs up. All right, so that leads to the more obvious question. Did you see the people who did this to you? Feeling my strength slowly coming back to me, I managed a nod and sat up a little. The memory of the two doctors were becoming clearer in my mind, and I sat up a little straighter in my bed, forgetting about the pain. There was a man, tall with dark hair parted to the side, and a small blonde woman. I couldn't make out their features very well because they were wearing face masks and full-body medical attire. I managed to say, my voice a little hoarse. The man had an accent, and based on what he said, I believe he's Serbian. The woman sounded American but hardly spoke. It was such a strange encounter, though. The man said he was just going to run some tests to find out what was wrong with me. Okay, did they happen to say where they were from or their names? The PA asked. Well, the doctor said his name was Dr. Grenfield, but he said it with a bit of an accent, and that the lady was Nurse Rosario. But now recalling the details, he said Rosalio instead of Rosario, which I just attributed to his accent. I assumed they were staff at the hospital. Who on earth were those people? We're not sure either. I'm so sorry this happened to you, Dimitri. Something like this would never have happened a few months ago, but unfortunately this pandemic has turned this hospital on its head. You could tell just by seeing the state of the hospital's entrance, but don't worry, you're in better hands now, Dr. Greenfield replied. So that was that. An experience that left me with an altered perception on how I view reality. I've become much more paranoid of who's really who, and have to now confirm my doctor's identity with them before I let them treat me. I don't know who those people were, whether they worked for someone or on their own, and why they wanted my blood, but I pray an experience like that never occurs again.